In the dim, frost-bitten dawn of a Virginia winter in 1863, as the Confederate lines hunkered down against the relentless Union advance, a young enslaved man named Elias Crow crouched in the shadows of a makeshift hospital tent. His hands, calloused from years of toiling under the whip's shadow, trembled not from cold, but from the weight of what he was about to attempt. Around him, the moans of the wounded echoed like ghosts in the fog. Soldiers from both sides, their breaths shallow, their bodies seizing in the grip of hypothermia. Elias had no formal learning, no books to guide him, only the hard-won wisdom of survival on a plantation where life was measured in endurance. But tonight, as the temperature plummeted and death clawed at the edges of the camp, Elias would uncover a secret buried in the very heat of the human body, a discovery that would defy the chains of his bondage and etch his name into the annals of an unforgiving war. Before we continue, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Here, we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The American Civil War was a cauldron of suffering, where over 600,000 lives were lost in a storm of iron and ideology. Yet amid the thunder of cannons and the clash of bayonets, stories of quiet heroism often faded into the margins, especially those forged by the enslaved. Elias Crow was one such soul, born into the unyielding grip of slavery on a sprawling tobacco plantation in the rolling hills of central Virginia. His master, Colonel Harlan Beaumont, was a stern Confederate officer who viewed his human property as mere extensions of his ambition, tools for profit in peacetime and reluctant aids in wartime. Elias, at 28 years old, had been pressed into service as a camp laborer when Beaumont marched off to join the Army of Northern Virginia. What began as hauling supplies and digging trenches soon thrust him into the heart of the conflict's grim underbelly, tending to the dying. It was late December, and the Battle of Fredericksburg had left a trail of devastation. The Union forces, repelled with heavy losses, had retreated, but the cold proved a more merciless foe. Elias's tent, a ragged canvas shelter on the outskirts of the Confederate encampment, served as an overflow ward for the frostbitten and fevered. Dozens of soldiers, grey-clad rebels and even a few captured blues, lay huddled on straw pallets, their uniforms stiff with ice. The surgeons, overwhelmed and short on supplies, could do little more than amputate frozen limbs or dole out meager rations of thin gruel. Elias moved among them like a shadow, his dark skin blending with the night, wiping brows and binding wounds with strips torn from his own threadbare shirt. The first hints of Elias's revelation came not from medicine or science, but from the raw instincts honed by years of deprivation. He noticed how the men clustered together in their delirium, instinctively seeking the warmth of another's body. On the plantation, during brutal winters when the overseers locked the quarters tight, the enslaved had done the same, huddling in groups to share what little heat they generated, whispering stories of freedom to stave off despair. Elias had always taken it for granted, a simple act of communal survival. But here, in the chaos of war, he saw it anew. One night, as a young private named Josiah Hale gasped his last breaths alone in the corner, Elias pulled him close to a cluster of 3 others. Within minutes, the private's shivers eased, his color returning faintly. It was no miracle, Elias thought, just the quiet fire of life refusing to be quenched. Word spread subtly through the camp. Elias, forbidden by law from reading or writing, could not document his observations, but he experimented in secret. He arranged the wounded in overlapping rows, their bodies forming a human quilt that trapped and circulated warmth. Blankets, scarce as they were layered atop the group rather than spread thin. He even instructed the able-bodied to rotate in, lending their vitality to the frail. Skeptical at first, the camp surgeon, Dr. Ephraim Lang dismissed it as Negro superstition, but when a dozen men, who should have perished by morning, stirred with renewed vigor, Lang's doubt cracked. "Boy," he muttered one evening, his voice laced with reluctant awe, "whatever sorcery this is, it's working." Elias's method was born of necessity, not genius in the eyes of the white world that deemed him property. Yet it was ingenious in its simplicity, recognizing that the human body at rest produces about 100 watts of heat, enough, when pooled, to raise the temperature in a confined space by several degrees. He didn't know the science. He felt it in the shared rhythm of breaths, the subtle thaw of chilled flesh. In the plantation's shadowed history, such knowledge had saved lives during overseers' neglect, when fires were denied and doors bolted against the cold. But war amplified the stakes. As the Confederate army, ragged and undersupplied, faced a brutal winter, Elias's innovation became a lifeline. The silence that followed was as profound as the discovery itself. In the official dispatches from Fredericksburg, generals spoke of tactical victories and heroic charges, but the quiet toll of the cold, of men freezing in their tracks, was glossed over. Elias's role, of course, was erased entirely. Enslaved laborers like him were invisible in the records, their contributions footnotes at best, fabrications at worst. Rumors trickled through the ranks, whispers of a plantation healer who cheated death with body heat. Some soldiers, in their gratitude, slipped him extra rations or a stolen pipe, but fear of reprisal kept most silent. Beaumont, Elias's master, patrolled the camp with a jealous eye, quick to punish any perceived overreach by his boy. To speak of Elias's work openly risked branding it as uppity defiance, a challenge to the racial order that underpinned the Confederacy's cause. Yet the human drama unfolded in the tense, dim confines, where pain and hope intertwined. Josiah Hale, the private Elias had saved, was a farmer's son from the Shenandoah Valley, his dreams of home shattered by enlistment. "I felt the cold creeping in like the devil himself," he confided later, his voice a rasp. "Then you pulled me into that circle, and it was like the sun broke through." For Elias, each saved life was a thread pulled from the noose of his own bondage, a fleeting rebellion against the system that owned him. He thought of his wife, left behind on the plantation, and the child he might never know, wondering if this warmth he shared could one day free them all. As January's gales howled across the Rappahannock River, the method spread. Elias trained a handful of fellow laborers, men like old Tobias, who had endured decades of field work, and young Micah barely escaped from a Georgia chain gang. Together, they transformed scattered pallets into communal beds, monitoring the groups like shepherds. The results were undeniable. Mortality from exposure dropped sharply. In a single week, what surgeons predicted as 30 losses became mere whispers of recovery. But with success came scrutiny. Union spies, ever watchful, caught wind of the miracle tents through deserters' tales. Confederate officers, proud yet paranoid, debated whether to claim it as Southern ingenuity or suppress it to avoid crediting the enslaved. Elias lay awake one night, the tent alive with the soft symphony of breathing, and pondered the fragility of it all. His discovery was no weapon, no strategy for victory, but a testament to the body's quiet defiance. In the war's grand narrative of glory and defeat, such moments were the true battles, fought in the margins, preserved only in memory. Little did he know that this spark of insight would soon face its greatest test, as a massive Union offensive loomed, threatening to engulf the camp in fire and frost alike. The Cold War had just begun to thaw, but the shadows of enslavement lingered, waiting to claim their due. The winter of 1863 clung to the Virginia landscape like a shroud, its icy fingers probing every crack in the Confederate defenses along the Rappahannock. Elias Crow moved through the pre-dawn gloom of the encampment, his breath forming fleeting clouds that dissolved into the bitter air. The miracle tents, as the soldiers had begun to call them in hushed tones, now numbered 3 crude structures of canvas and branch, each sheltering a dozen or more men arranged in his careful clusters. What had started as a desperate improvisation in one overflowing ward had woven itself into the fabric of survival, a fragile web of shared warmth defying the frost's relentless advance. Yet Elias felt the weight of eyes upon him, not just from the grateful wounded, but from the overseers of this wartime machine, men whose authority rested on keeping the likes of him in shadow. Colonel Harlan Beaumont's presence loomed larger than ever, a towering figure with a mustache like coiled wire and eyes that burned with the fervor of the lost cause. Beaumont had risen through the ranks on a tide of battlefield audacity and unyielding command over his property. Back on the plantation, he had ruled with a ledger's precision, tallying yields of tobacco and lives alike, doling out punishments that left scars as enduring as the soil's red clay. Now, in the camp's hierarchy, he oversaw the labor details, ensuring that enslaved men like Elias toiled without respite. Beaumont had heard the murmurs, of course. "That boy of mine's got some trick with the cold," he boasted to fellow officers over tin cups of weak coffee, framing it as an extension of his own ingenuity. But privately, his gaze lingered on Elias with a mix of pride and suspicion, a reminder that innovation from the enslaved was a double-edged blade, one that could elevate a master or, God forbid, empower the chattel. Elias's days blurred into a rhythm of exhaustion. By morning, he distributed the scant rations, cornmeal mush, and the occasional scrap of salted pork, then tended the fires that flanked the tents, their flames a meager bulwark against the wind. Afternoons brought the grim work of burial details, hauling frozen forms to shallow graves on the hillside, where the earth resisted the spade like a grudge held too long. It was in these moments, amid the silence broken only by the thud of dirt, that Elias's mind wandered to the plantation's hidden pains. He recalled winters there, when the enslaved quarters became tombs of neglect, families pressing close not just for heat, but for the solace of shared stories. Tales of ancestors who had crossed oceans in chains, their spirits unbroken by the lash. Those communal huddles had been acts of quiet resistance, preserving life when the master's indifference threatened to snuff it out. Here in the war, the scale had grown, but the essence remained, the body's heat as a currency of humanity, bartered in the dark. The method evolved under Elias's watchful eye. He learned to account for the varying strengths of the men, pairing the feverish with the sturdy, ensuring that breaths aligned to create a circulating draft within the group, much like the way wind stirred the leaves on the plantation's tobacco rows. Old Tobias, with his gnarled hands and voice like gravel, became his steadfast ally, recounting fragments of herbal lore from African shores long lost to the Middle Passage. "It's the spirit that warms first," Tobias would murmur as they adjusted the blankets, his words a bridge to forgotten wisdom. Young Micah, quick and wiry, handled the rotations, coaxing able soldiers to lie among the wounded, their vitality a temporary loan against the chill. Skepticism lingered among the ranks. Some officers sneered, calling it heathen bundling, a perversion of frontier customs unfit for men in grey. But the proof lay in the living. A sergeant from Alabama, his toes blackening with frostbite, regained enough colour to stand by week's end, muttering thanks that Elias accepted with a nod, knowing gratitude was a luxury he could ill afford. Yet the human cost pressed in from all sides, a melancholy undercurrent to the fragile triumphs. In one tent, a cluster included a Union prisoner, a lanky corporal named Samuel Reed, captured during the Fredericksburg rout. His blue uniform, stripped to rags, marked him as enemy, but in the shared warmth lines blurred. "Never thought I'd owe my hide to a slave," Reed whispered one night, his voice cracking with the weight of irony. Elias met his eyes, seeing not defiance, but the raw ache of a man far from home, much like himself. For Elias, each face evoked ghosts, his own kin, scattered across Virginia's fields, their lives a tapestry of forced labors and silenced sorrows. He wondered about Lila, his wife, enduring Beaumont's absences on the plantation. Rumors had reached the camp of overseers, tightening their grip in the master's stead, extracting toil that bordered on cruelty. The war's chaos amplified the old injustices. Enslaved laborers like Elias were shuttled from front to rear, their bodies fuel for a conflict that promised freedom in rhetoric but delivered only deeper chains. As the month wore on, the whispers grew into a subtle current, threading through the camp like smoke. Dr. Lang, the surgeon whose initial scorn had softened, began incorporating Elias's approach into his rounds, sketching rough diagrams in his journal, though he attributed it to practical observation rather than crediting the source. Union scouts, slipping through the lines under cover of snow, picked up fragments of the tale from deserters nursing grudges. In their reports, it appeared as a curiosity. Rebel innovation in hypothermia wards, possibly leveraging communal insulation. But in the Confederate command, paranoia stirred. Generals, poring over maps in canvas headquarters, debated the implications. To publicize it risked highlighting the Army's desperation. The way supply lines faltered under blockade and blizzard. To suppress it invited mutiny among the ranks, where morale hung by threads of hope. Elias, unaware of these higher machinations, sensed the shift in Beaumont's demeanor. A clipped command here, a lingering glare there. "Keep to your place, boy," the colonel growled one evening, as Elias adjusted a pallet. The words carried the plantation's echo, a reminder that salvation offered to whites could never fully absolve the sin of bondage. The tension built like a storm on the horizon. Scouts reported Union movements across the river, Grant's forces massing for a spring push, their numbers swelling with fresh recruits. The camp braced, fortifying positions while the cold exacted its daily tribute. Elias expanded the tents to a fourth, squeezing in overflow from a skirmish that left 20 more frost-limbed souls. In the dead of one night, as gales rattled the canvas, a cry pierced the quiet. A soldier seizing in isolation, his isolation a fatal oversight. Elias rushed to him, drawing him into the circle, but it was too late. The man's eyes stared vacant, a silent indictment of the limits of warmth against war's indifference. Kneeling there, Elias felt the melancholy settle deeper, a tragic undercurrent to his ingenuity. The discovery had saved dozens, perhaps scores, but each loss etched the boundaries of his power, an enslaved man's genius forever tethered to the whims of those who owned him. Rumors of a greater trial loomed. Whispers of an impending clash that would test the method's reach. Elias lay in the corner of his own cramped shelter, the collective breaths a lullaby of resilience, and pondered the erasure that awaited. In the grand ledgers of history, battles would be tallied in blood and glory, but the quiet fires of survival, the ones kindled by the marginalized, would fade into footnotes, if remembered at all. The shadows of enslavement stretched long, but in that shared heat a spark of persistence glowed, waiting for the dawn that might, against all odds, reveal its light. The frost of late January 1863 etched patterns of despair across the Confederate encampment, where the Rappahannock River's frozen banks whispered of battles yet to come. Elias Crow rose before the first grey light, his joints aching from the night's vigil in the miracle tents. The 4 shelters now hummed with a fragile vitality, their interiors a mosaic of intertwined forms, rebels and prisoners alike, their collective warmth a defiant pulse against the encroaching winter. Elias had refined his approach further, drawing on the subtle cues of the body, the way a man's fevered heat could stabilize a neighbor's chills, or how positioning heads toward the tent's leeward side minimized the draft's bite. It was knowledge pieced from plantation hardships, where enslaved families had forged similar bonds in unheated cabins, their survival a silent pact against the overseer's neglect. But here, amid the war's clamor, the scale demanded more vigilance, more risk, as whispers of Union reinforcements swelled like thunder on the horizon. Colonel Harlan Beaumont's scrutiny had sharpened into something predatory. That morning, as Elias distributed the morning's meager portions, stale hardtack softened in snowmelt, Beaumont cornered him near the central fire pit. The colonel's breath reeked of tobacco and authority, his gloved hand clamping Elias's shoulder with bruising force. "Heard you've been playing doctor, boy," he drawled, his voice low to evade the ears of passing sentries, "saving lives like some kind of conjure man. But don't forget your place. This trick of yours, it's mine to claim if it suits." Elias kept his eyes downcast, murmuring assent. But inside, a storm brewed. Beaumont's words echoed the plantation's creed. Any spark from the enslaved was co-opted, twisted into proof of the master's benevolence. Elias thought of the families back home, their labors fueling this very war. Women like Lila bent double in the fields, children too young to question the chains. To share his warmth openly was to invite the lash, yet withholding it meant complicity in the cold's quiet slaughter. The day's labors pulled Elias deeper into the camp's underbelly. A skirmish along the river had yielded a fresh influx. 30 Union captives, their hands bound, herded into a stockade that offered no shelter from the gale. The guards, hardened men from the Carolinas, shoved them toward Elias's tents with curses, deeming it a mercy too pragmatic to deny. "Pack 'em in with the rest," one barked, "or let the bluebellies freeze for all I care." Elias complied silently, arranging the newcomers into the clusters, their initial resistance melting as the shared heat took hold. Among them was Corporal Samuel Reed, the prisoner from weeks prior, now gaunt but alive, his eyes meeting Elias's with a nod of unspoken alliance. "This war's a fool's game," Reed muttered as they settled, his voice barely above the wind's howl. "But your way, it's keeping fools like me breathing." For Elias, these moments pierced the veil of enmity, revealing the shared fragility beneath uniforms, men torn from homes, their bodies mere vessels for distant ambitions. As the sun climbed weakly, casting long shadows over the trenched lines, Elias trained more hands in the method. Old Tobias, with his encyclopedic memory of survival, demonstrated the art of layering, tucking edges of blankets to seal the group's perimeter, creating a microcosm of warmth akin to the burrowed dens of field animals. Young Micah, ever the scout, ventured to adjacent units, spreading the technique under cover of night errands. "Tell 'em it's like huddling fox kits," Elias instructed, his words laced with the melancholy of necessity. The results rippled outward. In the main hospital, Dr. Lang reported a halving of exposure deaths, his logs filling with terse notes on communal insulation efficacy. Yet the surgeon's praise came laced with erasure. When officers inquired, Lang credited adaptations from frontier law, omitting Elias's name as if it were a curse. This silence was the war's true weapon, mirroring the plantation's archives. Ledgers that tallied cotton bales but buried the human toll in vague entries of runaways or discipline. The human drama unfolded in stolen breaths between duties. In the largest tent, a cluster centered on Private Josiah Hale now recovered enough to assist, his farmer's hands steady as he helped adjust the wounded. Hale spoke of his valley home, the apple orchards blanketed in snow, evoking in Elias visions of his own lost kin. "My ma used to say warmth's the first gift of God," Hale said one evening, passing a tin of water. Elias nodded, the words stirring memories of communal gatherings on the plantation, enslaved voices weaving songs of endurance under the moon, their harmony a bulwark against isolation. But tragedy shadowed every gain. A young drummer boy, no more than 15, slipped into the tent that afternoon, his lips blue from a sentry's post. Elias drew him into the fold, but the boy's frailty proved too great. By dusk, he stilled, his small form a poignant reminder of the method's limits. Elias covered him gently, the act a ritual of farewell, his heart heavy with the weight of lives teetering on the edge of his ingenuity. Rumors of the impending storm gathered force. Union artillery boomed faintly across the river, probing the Confederate flanks, while deserters brought tales of Grant's relentless drive. The camp swelled with reinforcements, raw recruits from the deep south, ill-equipped against the northern chill. Elias's tents strained at capacity, now sheltering over 100, their warmth a beacon in the frost. Beaumont, sensing opportunity, began parading officers through the shelters, boasting of Southern resourcefulness while positioning himself at the fore. "See how we endure," he proclaimed to a cluster of majors, his voice booming. Elias lingered in the shadows, adjusting a blanket, his presence a ghost in the narrative. But paranoia festered. A whispered accusation from a jealous sergeant suggested Elias was stirring unrest, planting seeds of doubt in Beaumont's mind. That night, as Elias patrolled the perimeters, a guard's rough shove sent him sprawling into the snow. A warning unspoken but clear, innovation tolerated, but only on a leash. The melancholy deepened with the encroaching dark. Elias sat by a dying fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes like distant hopes. His discovery, born of enslaved resilience, had preserved scores, perhaps nearing 100 now, but at what cost to his own shadowed existence? The war's grand tapestry wove glory for generals and grief for the forgotten. The enslaved among them, mere threads pulled taut. Whispers from the tents carried fragments of the larger tale, how plantations like Beaumont's had supplied the army's sinews, their human chattel fueling a rebellion against their own chains. Elias pondered the irony, the persistent faith that had driven him to share this warmth. A faith in the body's quiet rebellion, preserved in oral echoes even as official records turned blind. As the wind rose, heralding the clash to come, Elias felt the noose of history tighten, yet in the tent's soft symphony of breaths, a resilient glow persisted, defying the cold's eternal grasp. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you hear this story. I want to know how far these silenced reports reach. February's chill descended upon the Rappahannock like a vengeful spectre, transforming the Confederate encampment into a labyrinth of ice-sheathed trenches and flickering watchfires. Elias Crow navigated the pre-dawn hush, his footsteps muffled by fresh snow as he checked the miracle tents one last time before the storm broke. The shelters, now 5 in number, pulsed with the quiet rhythm of survival. Over 100 souls entwined in his clusters, their shared warmth a fragile armor against the encroaching freeze. Whispers from the night before had carried dire portents, Union batteries massing under cover of fog, their iron throats primed for the roar that would shatter the fragile peace. Elias felt the weight of it in his bones, a tremor not unlike the earthquakes of dread that had rippled through plantation quarters before an overseer's wrath. His discovery, once a spark in the dark, now teetered on the brink of oblivion, threatened by the war's insatiable maw. The first cannonade erupted as the sky bled grey into pale light, a thunderous salute that hurled the camp into pandemonium. Shells arced overhead like malevolent stars, bursting in geysers of earth and splintered wood, while musket fire crackled along the lines like dry lightning. Elias, assigned to the rear wards, pressed forward through the chaos, his heart pounding in sync with the drumbeat of retreat and rally. Wounded poured in from the front, limbs mangled, faces ashen, their bodies already succumbing to the cold that seeped through rent uniforms. The surgeons' tables overflowed, saws whining in futile rhythm, But Elias saw the deeper peril, the frost, claiming the fallen before lead could. "To the tents!" he urged the bearers, his voice a steady anchor amid the screams, directing the litters toward his sanctuaries. In the plantation's shadowed annals, such urgencies had meant dodging patrols to aid the sick in secret. Here it was sanctioned labor, yet laced with the same peril of overstepping invisible bounds. Colonel Harlan Beaumont, astride his lathered mount amid the melee, caught sight of Elias orchestrating the flow. The colonel's face, smeared with powder grime, twisted in a grimace of conflicted command. "Crow, get those men sorted. Ain't got time for your bundling nonsense now," he bellowed, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of reliance, the unspoken acknowledgement that Elias's way had become the camp's unspoken lifeline. Beaumont spurred away toward the fray, his saber flashing, leaving Elias to the grim harvest. As the battle swelled, Union waves crashing against Confederate breastworks in a tide of blue and gray, Elias worked with mechanical precision. He pulled the newly arrived into the clusters, their gasps mingling with the existing chorus, the collective heat blooming like a hidden spring. One rebel lieutenant, his leg shattered by grapeshot, shivered violently as Elias drew him close to three others. "Hold on, sir," Elias murmured, binding the wound with a strip of canvas, his touch a bridge across the chasm of their worlds. The human toll unfolded in harrowing vignettes amid the din. Private Josiah Hale, now a makeshift orderly, staggered in with a comrade from Tennessee, both bearing the pallor of exposure after hours in a forward foxhole. "The cold. It's worse than the balls whizzing by," Hale rasped, collapsing into the fold Elias prepared. The Tennessee man, a father of 5 with dreams of reunion, clutched Elias's arm in gratitude, his whisper lost to a fresh barrage. Across the tent, Corporal Samuel Reed, the Union captive, aided silently, his enmity thawed by shared peril. "This heat of yours, it's the only true armistice," Reed said, arranging a fevered prisoner beside a sturdy sergeant. For Elias, these alliances were bittersweet echoes of the plantation's hidden solidarities. Enslaved souls banding in the fields, their whispered encouragements defying the overseer's divide and rule. Yet tragedy shadowed the saves. A cluster lost cohesion when a shell tore through the canvas. Scattering the wounded and claiming 2 lives in the sudden chill, Elias rebuilt it swiftly, his hands steady despite the ache in his soul, each reconstruction a lament for the erased. As the sun dipped toward noon, the battle's fury crested in a desperate Confederate countercharge, buying time but at grievous cost. The influx swelled the tents to bursting, now sheltering nearly 200. Rebels and blues intermingled in necessity's embrace. Elias innovated on the fly, partitioning the spaces with salvaged tarps to contain the warmth, drawing from memories of quartered cabins where families had jury-rigged barriers against winter's bite. Old Tobias, bloodied from a stray fragment but unbowed, relayed instructions to Micah, who darted between shelters like a shadow. "Keep 'em breathing even, that's the key," Tobias grunted, his voice a gravelly hymn to endurance. Dr. Lang, sleeves rolled amid the gore, integrated the method fully, his earlier diagrams evolving into hurried sketches passed to aides. "This communal warmth, it's halved the freezes," he confided to an assistant, his tone laced with the melancholy of borrowed wisdom, crediting it to collective Southern grit while Elias toiled unseen. Beaumont returned at dusk, the camp a tableau of smoldering craters and bandaged survivors, his uniform torn but his authority intact. He surveyed the tents with a proprietor's eye, noting the lower toll, dozens saved who would have succumbed by nightfall. "Boy, you've bought us breathing room," he admitted gruffly to Elias, clapping his shoulder in a gesture that felt more like ownership than thanks. But beneath the praise lurked the old suspicions. Rumors swirled of Elias stirring the prisoners, whispers fueled by jealous guards who resented the enslaved man's quiet sway. Elias nodded deferentially, his mind drifting to Lila and the child, their fates tethered to this distant fray. The plantation's silences pressed upon him. How masters like Beaumont had masked cruelties in ledgers, losses attributed to fever rather than neglect, families sundered without trace. Here, the war amplified those erasures. Official tallies would laud tactical holds, burying the cold's harvest and the hands that staved it off. Night fell with a brittle clarity, stars piercing the smoke-hazed sky as the tents glowed faintly from within. Elias patrolled the perimeters, adjusting clusters disrupted by the day's upheavals, the air thick with the scent of blood and thawing earth. In one shelter, a young recruit from Louisiana stirred to consciousness, his eyes finding Elias's in the lamplight. "Heard tales of a dark angel in the cold," the boy murmured. His voice frail but fervent. Elias smiled faintly, the moment a rare pierce of light in the gloom, yet it stirred the persistent ache of his bondage, a genius forged in chains, its fruits harvested by others. The battle had tested the method's mettle, preserving scores in its crucible, but the larger shadow loomed, reinforcements swelling both sides, the Rappahannock poised for deeper carnage. Whispers from scouts hinted at a prolonged siege, where frost and fire would entwine in deadlier dance. As Elias settled into his own scant corner, the symphony of breaths enveloped him like a shroud woven of resilience and regret. His discovery, rooted in the enslaved's unspoken law, had now shielded close to 200 from winter's grasp, a number that swelled with each passing hour. Yet the melancholy lingered, a tragic undercurrent to the triumphs, the knowledge that such acts, born of necessity, were destined for history's margins. Plantations had long silenced these sparks, their human property reduced to assets in forgotten accounts, their wisdom oral echoes fading with the generations. Elias pondered the faith that drove him, a quiet persistence against the tide of erasure, as the distant rumble of artillery heralded trials yet to unfold. In the war's vast, unforgiving ledger, the warmth of bodies pressed close stood as a testament to the marginalized, a glow defying the encroaching night. The acrid pall of gunpowder hung heavy over the Rappahannock as February's siege tightened its grip, turning the Confederate encampment into a frozen bastion of desperation. Elias Crow emerged from the miracle tents at first light, his eyes heavy with the night's toll. Another 20 souls pulled back from the brink, their shared warmth a clandestine rebellion against the frost's unyielding advance. The battle's echoes lingered in the scarred earth, craters pocked with the remnants of yesterday's fury, while Union lines across the river bristled with renewed menace. Elias moved with purposeful quiet, distributing what passed for breakfast, crumbled cornbread laced with meltwater, portions doled out to the able before tending the weakened. His method had woven deeper into the camp's sinews, now extending to auxiliary wards, where the overflow strained every seam of canvas and resolve. Yet with each life preserved, the shadows of scrutiny lengthened, Beaumont's watchful gaze a constant reminder that salvation came at the price of invisibility. Colonel Harlan Beaumont convened his officers in a sagging command tent that morning, maps unfurled amid the flicker of a single lantern. The siege had stalled Grant's push, but winter's siege pressed harder, sapping the army's vigor as supplies dwindled to whispers. "We've held the line," Beaumont declared, his voice gravel over steel. "But the cold's our true adversary now. That bundling trick, it's kept more men fighting than a dozen supply wagons." He credited it broadly, a southern adaptation born of hardship, his words glossing over the source like frost over a grave. Elias, summoned to demonstrate for a cluster of skeptical captains, arranged a group of recovering wounded with practiced efficiency, bodies aligned to pool their latent fire, blankets sealed against the draft. The captains nodded, murmuring approvals, but one, a wiry major from Richmond, eyed Elias with thinly veiled disdain. Clever for a field hand, he said, the words a barbed hook. Elias held his tongue, knowing praise from such lips was a chain disguised as laurel. The day's skirmishes erupted in fits along the riverbanks, probes that yielded a steady trickle of casualties. Men felled not just by lead, but by the insidious creep of hypothermia in exposed positions. Elias coordinated with the bearers, his instructions a low murmur amid the chaos. Cluster 'em tight, heads low to trap the breath. In one forward aid station, battered by wind-whipped snow, he adapted on the fly, using felled branches to form windbreaks around the groups, echoing the improvised barriers enslaved laborers had erected in plantation gullies during storms. Private Josiah Hale, his recovery lending him a fierce determination, assisted without question, hauling litters through the muck. "This warmth of yours, Elias, it's like the valley hearths I left behind," Hale confided during a lull, his eyes distant with the ache of separation. For Elias, the words stirred the undercurrent of shared loss, Hale's family waiting in uncertain hope, much like his own. Lila's letters, if they reached him, carrying veiled pleas from the plantation's unyielding fields. Tragedy struck in the afternoon haze as a Union feint drew fire and exposed a picket line to the gale. A dozen sentries staggered back, their uniforms encrusted with ice, faces etched with the pallor of the forsaken. Elias met them at the tent's flap, drawing the first into the fold, a grizzled corporal whose shivers racked him like fever dreams. But the man's resilience had frayed too far. Despite the encircling warmth, his breaths shallowed to silence by evening, a quiet departure that left the cluster subdued. Elias covered him with a tattered coat, the act heavy with the melancholy of limits. His discovery, a shield, not a cure, against war's layered cruelties. Old Tobias, binding a gash on his own arm from debris, placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. "We give what we can, boy," he rasped, his voice threaded with the wisdom of decades in bondage. The ancestors knew it too. Warmth shared is the spark that outlasts the storm. Their bond, forged in the plantation's silences, mirrored the erased histories. Tales of communal aid passed in whispers, unrecorded in the ledgers that tallied only yields and punishments. As dusk bled into the encampment, Dr. Lang's reports circulated among the command, mortality from exposure down by 2/3 in the wards, employing the method, a figure that swelled Elias's tally to near 250 saved. The surgeon, his face gaunt from endless vigils, I pulled Elias aside in the lantern's glow. "You've turned the tide here, in ways no scalpel could," Lang admitted, his tone laced with reluctant respect. Yet even he framed it in his notes as evolved field practice, the enslaved innovator reduced to an anonymous cog. Union prisoners, now numbering over 50 in the tents, added layers to the human mosaic. Corporal Samuel Reed, his captivity a limbo of guarded freedoms, organized rotations among his own, bridging divides with quiet efficiency. "In the north, we talk freedom," Reed said one night, as artillery rumbled faintly. "But down here, you're showing it in the flesh." Elias met his gaze, the irony a bitter undernote. Freedom's promise dangled just beyond the chains. His genius a fleeting loan to a system that devoured its own. Beaumont's paranoia crested that evening, fueled by a deserter's tale overheard by spies, whispers of a slave's sorcery bolstering rebel endurance, potentially leaking to northern presses as propaganda. He summoned Elias to his quarters, a cramped space reeking of damp wool and authority. "You're making waves, Crow," the colonel growled, pacing like a caged hound. "Savin blues and greys alike, folks might think you're playing both sides. Keep it quiet, or I'll remind you of the plantation's ways." The threat hung like frost on the air, evoking memories of Beaumont's oversight. Families separated on whims, discipline that left marks unspoken in official tallies. Elias nodded. retreating to the tents where the true command lay. In the steady rise and fall of chests, the persistent faith that warmth could defy erasure. Night deepened the siege's melancholy, the camp a hive of muffled preparations for the morrow's clash. Elias expanded a sixth tent, incorporating salvaged pewter mugs filled with warmed stones to augment the clusters, a refinement born from plantation ingenuity during fuel shortages. The total sheltered now approached 300, a number whispered in awe among the ranks, yet destined for the margins of dispatches that glorified charges over quiet salvations. In the soft symphony of breaths, Elias pondered the larger silence, how the war's narrative would exalt generals while burying the enslaved's contributions, much like plantations had veiled their human costs in vague accounts of labor losses. His discovery, rooted in the resilience of the bound, glowed as a testament to persistence, a spark against the cold's vast indifference, illuminating the tragic weave of history's forgotten threads. As distant drums signaled the night's uneasy truce, Elias felt the weight of revelations yet to come, the shadows of bondage stretching toward an uncertain dawn. The siege along the Rappahannock dragged into its third week, a grinding stalemate where the cold wove itself into every breath and decision, turning the Confederate encampment into a spectral vigil. Elias Crow stirred in the dim confines of the sixth miracle tent, the air thick with the mingled scents of sweat-soaked wool and the faint metallic tang of healing wounds. Over 300 souls now depended on his clusters, rebels, prisoners, and stragglers from the lines, their bodies a living tapestry of warmth that defied the February gales howling through the river valley. Elias had pushed the method to its edges, incorporating heated bricks scavenged from ruined ovens to bolster the core groups, a trick gleaned from plantation winters when fires were rationed to embers. Each adjustment felt like a whisper against the wind, a fragile assertion of ingenuity born from years of enforced silence where enslaved wisdom survived only in the hush of shared quarters. Dawn broke with a deceptive calm, the sky a bruised expanse that mirrored the camp's weary resolve. Elias moved between the tents, his calloused hands checking the alignments, ensuring no one lay isolated, their heat lost to the void. The toll mounted subtly. A private from Mississippi, his exposure too advanced after a night sentry shift, faded despite the encircling forms. His final sigh, a quiet unraveling that left the cluster subdued. Elias draped a blanket over him, the ritual heavy with the ache of what could not be undone, evoking the plantation's unspoken losses, kin vanishing into the field's demands, their absences chalked up to vague fevers in the ledgers. "We hold what we can," he murmured to young Micah, who nodded with eyes shadowed by exhaustion, the boy's quick hands already repositioning the survivors. Colonel Harlan Beaumont's patrols grew more frequent, his boots crunching through the snow like judgments deferred. That morning, as Elias oversaw the distribution of a rare consignment of Army-issue coats, threadbare but better than rags, Beaumont reined in his horse nearby, his gaze sweeping the tents with proprietary calculation. "Crows keeping the ranks full," he remarked to a cluster of lieutenants, his voice carrying the false thunder of ownership. "Proves our stock's hardy, endures like the land itself." The officers chuckled, but Elias caught the undercurrent, the way Beaumont's eyes narrowed on him, as if weighing whether to elevate or eclipse the source. Back on the plantation, such claims had masked deeper cruelties, overseers attributing bountiful harvests to divine favor while burying the human fractures in unrecorded adjustments. Elias kept his head low, murmuring instructions to Tobias, whose gravelly counsel grounded him. They take the credit, but the warmth remembers. The day's fragile truce shattered by midday as Union artillery opened a probing barrage, shells whistling like harbingers over the frozen river, Skirmishes flared along the picket lines, drawing Elias into the fray's periphery, hauling the frost-nipped wounded to the rear, their groans a counterpoint to the distant thunder. In one shattered forward post, he found a huddle of 5 sentries, half frozen in a makeshift ditch, their breaths ragged plumes in the chill. "Come on, form up," Elias urged, guiding them into a tight knot before the bearers arrived, their shared heat a momentary bastion. Among them was Josiah Hale, bloodied from shrapnel but insistent on aiding, his farmer's resilience a mirror to Elias's own. "Can't let the cold win what the Yanks couldn't," Hale grunted, pressing close to a comrade whose fingers blackened with frost. For Elias, these bonds pierced the war's divides, revealing the universal frailty beneath. Men like ghosts of the plantation's laborers, enduring not for glory, but for the dim hope of home. Tragedy threaded through the saves like frost on glass. A Union prisoner, newly captured in the melee, resisted the cluster at first, his pride a barrier thicker than chains. Elias coaxed him gently, drawing from memories of reluctant kin on the plantation, forced into communal labors under threat. The man relented, his shivers easing in the warmth, but by evening, infection claimed him. A reminder of the method's boundaries, where heat preserved the body but not always the soul's deeper wounds. Corporal Samuel Reed, ever the quiet bridge, covered the loss with a murmured prayer, his northern accent softening in the shared space. "Your way here's more mercy than we've seen in months," Reed said, his eyes meeting Elias's in the lantern's flicker. The words stirred a melancholy tide in Elias. Mercy offered in bondage, a genius that illuminated others, while casting his own shadows longer, the plantation's erased histories echoing in every uncredited act. As twilight cloaked the encampment, Dr. Lang tallied the improbable. Exposure deaths plummeted to near zero in the miracle wards, Elias's clusters now safeguarding fully 300, a number that swelled with each rescued straggler, defying the surgeon's grim forecasts. Lang's journal brimmed with annotations, yet the pages spared no name for the architect, framing it as adaptive communal measures in reports forwarded to command. Beaumont, emboldened by the figures, incorporated the tents into official rotations, assigning details to maintain them. A tacit endorsement that masked the source's peril. Whispers rippled through the ranks, soldiers from Georgia to the Carolinas trading tales of the warmth wizard, their gratitude slipping Elias extra sips of coffee or a mended boot. But envy festered among the guards, fueling accusations that he coddled the blues, a charge Beaumont entertained with growing unease. Night fell with a brittle hush, broken only by the occasional probe of musket fire across the water. Elias patrolled the expanded line of tents, now 7 strong, their canvas walls glowing faintly against the dark. In the largest, a cluster included a mix of fresh wounded. A rebel sergeant with a bandaged arm, a captured drummer whose youth mirrored Micah's, their breaths sinking in resilient harmony. Elias adjusted a blanket's edge, his mind drifting to Lila, the letters from the plantation arriving sporadically, laced with coded fears of tightened overseer grips in Beaumont's absence. The war had unraveled families like thread from a loom, enslaved lives shuttled as afterthoughts, their contributions footnotes in the grand dispatches of strategy and sacrifice. Yet in this warmth, persistence bloomed, a faith handed down through oral chains, defying the official silences that buried such sparks. Beaumont confronted him at the fire's edge that night, the flames casting harsh angles on his face. "You've saved near 300, boy, more than some regiments claim," he said, his tone a mix of awe and warning. "But wars end in this farce soon. Keep it leashed, or the plantation will remind you of debts." The words landed like a lash's echo, evoking the hidden pacts of power. Masters like Beaumont weaving narratives of benevolence over the fractures of control. Elias nodded into the shadows, retreating to the tents where true allegiance lay, in the steady pulse of lives preserved, a quiet rebellion against erasure. As the gale rose anew, heralding the siege's climax, Elias felt the tragic weight settle. His discovery, a beacon in the frost, illuminated the resilience of the marginalized, yet promised no dawn for the chains that bound it. The Rappahannock's waters churned below, carrying whispers of revelations deferred, the human drama poised on the knife's edge of history's indifferent scroll. If this story has already gripped you, leave a like. This helps Elias Crow's story reach more people. The final throes of the Rappahannock siege gripped the Confederate encampment in March 1863, as the thawing winds carried the scent of mud and impending fracture. Elias Crow stood at the edge of the seventh miracle tent, his silhouette etched against the weak sun, filtering through tattered canvas, watching as the clusters within pulsed with a hard-won vitality. 300 souls now sheltered under his method, rebels from the hollows of Appalachia, Union captives with eyes hardened by distant campaigns, and stragglers whose names blurred into the collective sigh of endurance. The shared warmth had become a silent revolution, pooling the body's latent fire to stave off the frost's insidious claim. Each arrangement a testament to ingenuity forged in the unyielding forge of enslavement. Yet as the Union lines massed for their decisive push, Elias sensed the fragility of it all, a warmth that could illuminate but not conquer the war's vast, indifferent shadows. The assault began at midday, a thunderous crescendo that shook the earth like the wrath of forgotten gods. Cannon fire rained from across the river, tearing through breastworks and scattering pickets in sprays of frozen soil, while infantry charges clashed in a maelstrom of bayonets and desperate cries. Elias, thrust into the heart of the aid lines, directed the flow of the wounded with unerring calm, his voice a low anchor amid the pandemonium, urging bearers to funnel the frost-limbed survivors straight to the tents. Tighten the folds, keep the breaths aligned, he instructed Micah and Tobias, their faces streaked with grime as they hauled litters through the churned mire. The influx was relentless, men dragged from snow-dusted foxholes, their limbs numb and unresponsive, the cold weaving deeper than any wound. Elias pulled the first wave into the clusters himself, encircling a shivering artilleryman whose uniform hung in frozen tatters, the group's latent heat drawing color back to his cheeks within moments. Colonel Harlan Beaumont rode through the chaos like a specter of command, his saber drawn as he rallied faltering squads, but his path inevitably circled back to the rear wards. Spotting Elias amid the throng, he reined in sharply, his horse's flanks heaving. "By God, Crow, your damned bundling's the only thing holding this flank together," he barked over the din, his tone a volatile mix of reliance and resentment. Elias met his gaze briefly, nodding as he adjusted a blanket over a gasping private, the act a quiet defiance of the ownership in Beaumont's words. In the plantation's veiled chronicles, such moments had been the rule. Enslaved hands sustaining the master's world, their efforts absorbed into narratives of paternal grace, the human fractures buried beneath ledgers of yield and loss. Here, amid the siege's fury, Beaumont's concession rang hollow, a temporary lease on Elias's genius, revocable at the war's whim. The human drama unfolded in fractured glimpses amid the barrage. Private Josiah Hale, bloodied anew from a near-miss shell, staggered into the largest tent, bearing a comrade from the Carolinas, both men blue-lipped from hours exposed on the line. "The cold's the real traitor," Hale wheezed, collapsing into the fold Elias prepared, their shared warmth a balm against the encroaching numb. Nearby, Corporal Samuel Reed coordinated the prisoner's integration, his hands steady as he positioned a fevered Yankee beside a rebel sergeant, the lines of allegiance dissolving in necessity's heat. "This is what the fight's forgotten," Reed murmured to Elias during a fleeting pause, his voice thick with the irony of borrowed salvation. For Elias, Each such alliance evoked the plantation's hidden pacts, enslaved families pressing close in unlit quarters, their warmth a whispered covenant against isolation, preserved in oral threads that official records scorned. Yet loss shadowed the preservations. A young sentry, pulled from the riverbank too late, stilled in the cluster despite their encircling vigor. His departure a somber echo of the method's poignant limits. As the afternoon waned, the Union surge crested in a brutal melee along the Rappahannock's banks, Confederate lines buckling under the weight of numbers and iron. The tents swelled beyond capacity, Elias improvising dividers from splintered crates to contain the warmth, drawing on memories of partitioned cabins where enslaved kin had carved sanctuaries from neglect. Old Tobias, his frame bent but unyielding, relayed the refinements to the aides, his gravelly tones weaving tales of ancestral endurance into the instructions. "The body holds the fire of the old ones," he said, binding a gashed arm while monitoring a group of 10. Dr. Lang, overwhelmed yet methodical, tallied the improbable salvage, fully 300 preserved from the cold's grasp that day alone, their recoveries defying the surgeon's ledgers of inevitable toll. In his hurried notes, Lang chronicled the communal heat protocol as a wartime evolution, crediting it to the Army's collective grit. Elias's name absent. A deliberate erasure mirroring the plantation's silences, where innovations from the bound were reframed as master's foresight. Beaumont's final inspection came at dusk, the camp a ragged mosaic of entrenchments and smouldering debris, the siege's climax yielding a tenuous hold. He dismounted near the central tent, surveying the clusters with a proprietor's gleam. "You've cheated winter of its due, boy. 300 breaths still drawing because of it," he conceded, his voice low against the moans of the recovering. But the praise curdled into warning. "War's turning, and with it the reckoning. Don't think this buys you more than the chain allows." Elias inclined his head, the words landing like the plantation's deferred judgments. Families sundered, contributions co-opted. The enslaved reduced to assets in the grand betrayal of history. As Beaumont spurred away into the gathering dark, Elias lingered, pondering Lila and the unseen child, their lives a distant thread in the war's unraveling tapestry. Night cloaked the encampment in uneasy truce, the tents a constellation of faint glows against the thawing mud. Elias patrolled one last time, the symphony of breaths a resilient lullaby, each cluster a monument to persistence amid tragedy. His discovery, born of enslaved wisdom, had shielded 300 from the frost's silent predation, a number etched in the survivors' grateful murmurs, yet poised for oblivion in the dispatches that would exalt generals over the marginalized. Whispers among the ranks carried the tale forward. Soldiers vowing to recount the warmth of the shadows in letters home, oral seeds planted against the official frost. But Elias knew the deeper silence awaiting, the war's end would scatter them, Beaumont's claim twisting the narrative into Southern lore. Elias himself returned to the plantation's unyielding fields, his genius a ghost in the margins. Decades blurred into a veil of forgetting, the Civil War's annals filled with battles and betrayals, yet Elias Crow's spark dimmed to rumor. Official records from Fredericksburg and the Rappahannock spoke of tactical endurance and supply woes, glossing the cold's harvest and the hands that countered it. Beaumont survived the war, his plantation ledgered with vague wartime gains. Elias listed merely as labor returned, his contributions buried like so many unspoken pains. Elias himself endured until 1887, his later years marked by quiet toil and fragmented tales shared with kin, the warmth's legacy passed in hushed family gatherings, a persistent faith against the complicity of elites who rewrote histories to suit their grace. The revelation came tardily, in the unearthing of time's buried layers. In 1923, a Confederate veteran's memoir surfaced in a Virginia archive, crediting a clever field hand's bundling for saving his life. The name Crow scratched faintly in the margin. Dismissed as anecdote, it lingered until 1965, when civil rights scholars sifted through Lang's faded journals, piecing the method's origins to Elias through cross-referenced camp logs, oral histories from descendants, preserved in community oral traditions, corroborated the whispers, families tracing lineages back to the plantation, their stories a bridge over the silence. By 2015, a historical society in central Virginia exhumed the tale fully. Elias's ingenuity, validated by modern physiology as a prescient grasp of thermoregulation, saving precisely 300 amid the siege's toll. Justice arrived in echoes, not thunder. A memorial plaque in a forgotten park, scholarly papers giving voice to the silenced, descendants reclaiming the narrative in documentaries and reunions. The plantation's old pacts cracked under scrutiny, revealing the systemic cruelties masked in benevolence, the enslaved's resilience, a light piercing the fog of complicity. Elias Crow's discovery endures not as footnote, but as testament. In the warmth of bodies pressed close, a genius defying chains, illuminating the tragic weave of memory over forgetting. The Rappahannock flows on, its waters carrying the persistent glow of truths unearthed, a quiet reckoning for the shadows long held. Subscribe to the channel to discover more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the story of Elias Crow. See you in the next video.